Thank you. First speaker when you get to sit down after your lunch, so I'll try and keep you awake. The personal papers of the architect, Professor Sir Leslie Martin, were purchased by the National Galleries of Scotland in 2002, and his professional papers were acquired by the Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA, in the same year. The Edinburgh Archive mainly consists of three major correspondences between Martin and his wife, the designer Sadie Spate, and Naum Garbo, Barbara Hepworth, and Ben Nicholson. And this paper examines that with Hepworth, which covers the period from 1935 to 1972 and contains 43 items, including letters and photographs. So is this the right? No? Oh. Sorry, I'm just going to check that's the right one. There we go. So Leslie Martin, who we see on the left, is renowned as much for his groundbreaking architectural practice as for his research and his contribution to education. And he held many important public and academic positions, such as being architect to the London County Council from 1953 to 56, and professor of architecture at Cambridge University from 1956 to 1972. And he was the architect of some remarkable post-war buildings, including the Royal Festival Hall on London South Bank and the Gulbenkian Foundation Centre for Modern Art in Lisbon in 1979, and closer to my home, the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama in Glasgow from 1987. Sadie Spate, who we see on the right, was also a qualified architect. They both trained at Manchester, and she had a celebrated career as a designer. In 1938, she was jointly commissioned with Martin by Herbert Reed to write the Flat Book, a reference book on contemporary furniture, fabric, and household products. Spate was a founder member of the Design Research Unit of the Council of Industrial Design and became renowned for her interior design schemes. She and Leslie Martin married in 1935. Martin and Spate first saw the work of Ben Nicholson at the Mayor Gallery in London in April 1934, and shortly afterwards they visited Nicholson in his studio in Hampstead, which he shared with Hepworth, and thus began a lifelong connection between the quartet based on friendship, patronage, and collaboration. The most obvious form of collaboration came about after Nicholson and Hepworth introduced Martin and Spate to Naum Garbo in 1936 at the opening of the Abstract and Concrete exhibition. Interests within the group were so closely affiliated that Leslie Martin became co-editor with Nicholson and Garbo of Circle International Survey of Constructive Art, which was published in 1937. Spate acted as secretary and with Hepworth decided its layout. This project is more fully covered in the Nicholson correspondence in the Edinburgh Archive and with the RIBA's holdings, rather than in the Edinburgh Hepworth material. Is that legible at all? Yeah, I'm not convinced it's even in focus. Thank goodness I put the quote there. So with regard to the Hepworth correspondence, this is the second letter from it, in which she wrote to Spate, and illustrates that combination of friendship and patronage which characterizes the material as a whole. And it actually came with an invoice dated the 8th of January 1935, in which Hepworth listed 3 works with prices, 2 paintings by Nicholson and 1 drawing by her, which the Martins had already purchased. And the accompanying letter updates them on personal and professional matters. She wrote, "This week has been simply hectic. We have both made thousands and thousands of journeys up and down the mall, moving Ben into his new studio, carrying innumerable canvases and frames and furniture. We are more or less straight now, and Ben is very, very happy to have a quiet spot to paint in without the marble chips, and I am busy filling up 7 the Mall with lumps of marble and stone." So Martin and Spate's patronage was to prove vital to Hepworth, not least in financial terms. In an undated letter of 1937 or 38, she wrote to Spate about Nicholson's impending divorce from Winifred Nicholson. I wonder whether you and Leslie could possibly give me a date when you could pay the remaining bit owing for the carving and painting you got. I am taking you at your word in writing and asking you this because a frightful crisis has arisen. We were not properly informed about the costs of this divorce business. We thought we had to pay after the divorce, and now quite suddenly we find that the money has to be paid into court before the case, and we have to find £63 immediately, or they threaten to withdraw proceedings. Knowing what this business means to Ben after all this long while, I feel I must make every effort. And Ben and Winifred's marriage was dissolved in 1938, and he and Hepworth married soon afterwards. At the end of August 1939, just days before the declaration of war, Hepworth Nicholson and their children moved to Cornwall. I'm very aware that I'm sure all of you know all of this backwards, where they were soon joined by Garbo and his wife Miriam. Not long afterwards, Martin and Spate moved from Hull to Hertfordshire, as Martin had been appointed Principal Assistant Architect to the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. Hepworth described her new circumstances in a letter of late 1939. We seem to be starting a market garden. I have never done so much hard digging in my life. I miss my home and studio and work just like hell. But life is settling down, and Ben gets time to paint now, and very soon I hope to get time to do some sculpture. The landscape is miraculous. In December 1939, Hepworth and her family moved to this house, Dunluce, a photograph of which was annotated by Nicholson and sent to the Martins. Their support of Hepworth professionally and personally continued during the war. They offered to store some of Hepworth's sculpture for her, lent her and Nicholson money, for example, £15 in late 1939, and cheered them up with news of their own projects in London. On the 9th of May 1940, Hepworth wrote to Leslie Martin to announce a breakthrough in her work. She wrote, "In spite of various and endless other activities, I have achieved what I think is a good new sculpture. I have only done it very small, but now I'm going to do it bigger. It is another form and colour which I am most interested in." And sadly, it's not very clear, but towards the upper left of the letter, she sketched what I think is the work on the right that Laura showed yesterday. And the sketch is annotated circular, deep blue intercepting hollows, red intercepting cone, and conical white. She doesn't say anything about colour of the string, I'm afraid. And I think this is sculpture with colour, deep blue and red, of which she made 5 small versions in plaster, of which the second is now in the Tate collection. Hepworth went on to explain further and to ask for Martin's opinion and help. The strings, of course, are halfway between paintings and sculpture. I wanted to discover something I could do which would sell for £5. I am doing 1 or 2 copies of each. I should be most interested to know if you think they are any good. If you do think so, would it be a bore for you to keep 1 or 2 and show them to anybody who might be interested and return the rest to me? And in fact, Martin and Spate did sort of persuade some of their friends to buy some work by Hepworth and Nicholson during the war. The letter concluded with a reflection on this development, its overlap with Martin's professional interests, and potential for continuing collaboration between them. She wrote, "I think I have discovered how to use colour and form together and to achieve a new power and experience, and I have discovered certain laws. I don't think anybody has done it before. To my knowledge, it has always been coloured sculpture. You have done it in relation to architecture. There's a lot of work to be done, and I only hope there will be time, because I think it has a direct bearing on a sort of pooled effort of architecture, sculpture, painting, and sociology." In a letter of the early 1940s, she actually goes on to suggest revisiting that circle idea of 1937. In a letter of the early 1940s, she wrote to Martin, Garbo, Ben and I have had long discussions. We have decided we must start a wartime chronicle because we feel the absolute necessity for creating a vehicle of expression between us all, and one that will make a link between those who are already in the Navy, Air Force, and Army. Also a thing which will bring us together with those young and so far unheard of people. It is absolutely necessary in our minds to discover the new impulses and unite them. And she invited Martin to become editor for everything to do with architecture, with Herbert Reed looking after prose and poetry, and Nicholson Garbo and herself looking after painting and sculpture. However, in the next letter in the archive, she explained she did not feel it was the right time to publish this chronicle, but reflected on the group's shared aims and achievements, writing, I think all we did pre-war was a preparation for just this. Concrete expression may be at an end for the moment, as far as we are concerned, but ideas are not at an end and must be expressed energetically in living. We may even have to go through a long phase of suffering before the constructive idea springs up as an expression of the people. Our few houses, sculpture, paintings were only a preview or research. They were the beginning and not the end of something. As we know, Hepworth decided to stay in Cornwall after the war, and in 1949 moved to Trewin Studio, and 2 years later she and Nicholson divorced. In the meantime, Hepworth and Martin found themselves playing major roles in the Festival of Britain. Hepworth's first commission, public commission, was from the Arts Council of Great Britain to create contrapuntal forms to stand on the South Bank in London during the festival, while Martin was responsible for the scheme concept and design for final completion of the nearby Royal Festival Hall. And in a letter of the 5th of April 1950, Hepworth wrote to Martin explaining that she was simply longing to see the inside of the concert hall. The whole of last Friday and Saturday I spent on the festival site. I got the figures up safely, and for half an hour I was able to consider them, and I was pleased. It was the culminating point of the year's work. She continued, I was very stimulated by certain shapes and colours and methods of construction on the site, and immensely excited when I walked all around the concert hall. The scale is so fine, and its shape in relation to the position. I really longed to get in. It must be glorious to be an architect and to see such an immense sculpture grow almost overnight. Hepworth and Martin's post-war careers developed apace. Martin was knighted in 1957, and Hepworth was made a Dame of the British Empire in 1965. Martin's patronage evolved accordingly, for example, providing details of the sculptures and drawings by Hepworth, which he and Spate had acquired in the 1930s and 40s, for inclusion in a monograph about her work. Accordingly, Spate annotated the letter on the left from Hepworth of the 11th of April 1959, with sketches and cataloguing details of 3 sculptures, 2 gouaches, and 1 collage in their collection, including 2 forms of 1938, which we can see on the right, and Ball, Plain, and Whole of 1936, which was on my first slide. The Hepworth correspondence in the Sir Leslie Martin personal archive ends with a letter dated the 11th of January 1972 to him, in which she expressed her delight about the recent republication of Circle, 35 years after they had first published it. She said, I think I told you how glad I was about the republication of Circle. It has become a very favourite book with students. I looked at it with a cold eye, and I thought it was jolly good and very contemporary. Following Hepworth's death in 1975, Martin and Spate's support of her work and reputation continued. The last letter in the Martin Hepworth material is one from Martin of the 3rd of July 1986 to A.D. Fraser Jenkins of the Tate. In it, he explained what he knew of Hepworth's sculpture Ball, Plain, and Whole, which the Tate had acquired in 1982. Martin wrote, We never bought anything from galleries, always directly from the artists themselves, who were, of course, our friends. We bought our first Barbara in January 1935, a collage, San Remi of 1931. We still have this. Sadie Spate died in 1992 and Leslie Martin in 2000. As I explained, his personal archive was acquired 2 years later by the National Galleries of Scotland, and it contains the correspondence with Hepworth, which I've outlined. It pays testament to the friendship, patronage, and collaboration between Hepworth, Martin, and Spate, and you are all welcome to come to Edinburgh to consult it for yourselves. Thank you.
I'm really grateful, thanks Eleanor, for asking me to come and speak. It gives me a chance to think about Hepworth Studios again and to look a bit more closely at some of the items there. Right. The Hepworth Studios Conservation Project and the research seminar, which Helena convened at the beginning of it, progressed our understanding of Hepworth's working spaces. And of course, we now have Sophie's book as well. So we have a pretty clear picture now of how much of what we see in the studios was arranged and how much is what you might call undisturbed evidence, which there was a bit of discussion about those different sort of states of the items in the studio in the research seminar at the beginning of the project, which I found very useful. So just going on. So the cupboard in the plaster studio was identified as one of the most authentic areas, left just as it was and not touched in the preparation of the studios for public display. It contains items that we do know relate to the making of plasters, such as gypsona bandage, kailstone fine casting plaster, etc. But there are other items which look promisingly as though they might relate to work on finished bronzes as well as plasters. These included a tin of bronze shavings, bags and jars of unidentified powder and crystals, plus bottles containing chemicals, specifically metal salts in solution being used to create chemical patinas. So I don't know how well you can see those. I actually had to freeze these off of film. Anyway, hopefully you might be able to see the labels on those. The bottles in the cupboard are better preserved than a lot of the other items in the studios because the environment is slightly buffered within the cupboards. And the paper labels can be easily read, whether or not you can read them in the slide. But many were obtained from T.C. Ledra, the chemist, which is still there in 4th Street in St. Ives. Looking more closely at these individual bottles revealed one which is used to colour bronze, copper sulfate, seen here on the left. The other labelled bottles all contain the same chemical, iron sulfate. And one of these, I was looking at the inventory that was made before the project started. One of these says copper, iron sulfate, and there's a handwritten addition on the bottle which looks like it says green coppers, so suggestive of the creation of green copper compounds, i.e. producing a green patination on bronze. But unfortunately, this is not the case. The label actually says green copperas, which is the old name for iron 2 sulfate, which actually, though it has nothing to do with copper, the name copperas dates from times when copper 2 sulfate, which is blue crystals, was known as blue copperas, and so iron 2 and zinc sulfate were known as green and white copperas just because of the colours of the crystals. So you can see here, this is iron 2 sulfate in crystalline form, and the colour looks like a bit like the colour you see on bronze sculptures, but it's nothing to do with it, unfortunately. But interestingly, iron sulfate is sometimes used to colour wood. And the cupboard also contained a small test tube of potassium permanganate and liquid ammonia. Both of these can also be used to colour wood, so I haven't looked into that. I don't know very much about Hepworth wood sculptures. And also, these chemicals have other uses, and liquid ammonia, many, many uses, including just for cleaning. So I can't really deduce much from that. So, being rather disappointed by the cupboard, I thought I'd have a look at the Palais Inventory, which was made during the the project. The Palais contents list does yield more chemicals potentially used for patinating. A number of bottles found together in the same area of the Palais, which Sarah was showing us, there was a shot of that area. It was like a corner with lots of bottles in a cardboard box. So these bottles, which were found together in quite sort of reasonable quantities, so they do seem to indicate that patinating was happening on site. So on the left is one of a number of bottles of ammonium hydrosulfide, which is used to create brown patinas and is often sold as liver of sulfur. One of these bottles of ammonium hydrosulfide has a handwritten label which just says bronze ammo sul, so it's clearly being used on the bronze. And on the right, I'm not sure how clearly you can see that label, it says poison, sal ammoniac. And this is the old name for ammonium chloride, which is a chemical very often used to make a green-blue patina. There are other bottles which are less well identified. One containing white powder is labelled to stain bronze, so intriguing. There's a bottle of blue, sort of turquoise blue salt solution. It's just labelled poison, but that could be copper nitrate, which looks like this in solution. Sorry. But the thing to remember about the Palais, as has been said, is that it's not a space like the cupboard. So we can't infer these chemicals were being used by Hepworth or at her behest. She only worked there between 61 and 67 personally. Then thereafter her assistants, and then it continued as a working space for the estate. So, we can't sort of draw as many conclusions from that. So, there are 3 recorded recipes for creating patinas on Hepworth sculptures that I know of. There's the one included in the Plasters book for the pale blue-green patina on the family of man that Laura spoke about, and 2 that have come to us via Ted Shepherd of Morris Singer Foundry. There was a correspondence between Ted Shepherd and a conservator, Tracy Power, and unfortunately I can't remember the date of that correspondence, but the Tate has copies which were passed to us by David Valence of Morris Singer. These 3 recipes, let's call them recipes, actually employ a very small range of patinating chemicals. So just these 4 patinating chemicals at the top on the right. Sorry, I've lost my thing. Oh yeah, and then calcium. So you see the 4 chemicals at the top are patinating chemicals, i.e. metal salts, which change the chemical makeup of the bronze surface, and that's what changes the color. And then at the bottom, calcium carbonate, or I call it whiting because that's what I was always taught to call it, because it's used for gesso and things like that. So it's very, very commonly found for all sorts of reasons in artist studios and foundries. But that was an ingredient in that patina, the cold blue-green patina that Laura was talking about. So it doesn't react with the bronze surface, but it either sort of just is added to it or kind of somehow bonds with the compounds that are being formed. Not quite clear how that happens. So if we look across to the other list of the studio cupboard in the Palais, we can see that all those documented chemicals may actually be present still in the studios in the Palais. And it's not really surprising to find only a small range, as despite the secrecy that surrounds patination recipes, which is how they're often described, and the amount of chemicals which, in theory, can be used to react with bronze and create different colours, you can actually achieve a great deal of variety using a very small range in different combinations and variously applied. So just to illustrate that, this is a few samples that were taken when we had a sort of patination training day recently. And this shows different colours which were achieved using only 4 chemicals. In this case, potassium sulfide, ferric nitrate, copper nitrate, copper acetate. So I'm sure you're keeping up with all these chemicals. But potassium sulfide is it sort of equates, potassium sulfide is the classic chemical for producing that rich brown colour on bronze, and they call it liver of sulfur. In the studio, it was ammonium hydrosulfide. They're sort of used for the same thing, but potassium polysulfide is the one that was included in the Hepworth recipe, Hepworth 1, as they called it, from Morris Singer, made up with just water. So two of the chemicals used here, copper nitrate, sorry, I'm getting confused now. Okay. Anyway, you can see from there's also the type of wax application can vary the effect. So you don't need very many chemicals to produce a lot of different effects, is what I'm trying to say. And two of the chemicals used here, ferric nitrate and copper acetate, are very common patinating chemicals which were not found in labelled bottles in any of Hepworth's spaces. However, they are both very easily homemade. So back to the cupboard. There are other items in the plaster studio cupboard that may be connected with Hepworth's colouring of bronzes. A white powder could be calcium carbonate, as used in the Family of Man recipe, or it could just be plaster of Paris, or it could be a white pigment. We'd have to analyse it to be sure. Pigments found in the cupboard could also have been added to patinating solutions, or to a lacquer like Laura was talking about with the rings. It might not have just been a straight lacquer. There could be a sort of golden coloured pigment like Aurora, yellow ochre, burnt sienna type pigment in it. Or they could more likely been used for colouring plasters as a guide to the founders, which we know that Hepworth did. Or they could be connected to other activities, given that Hepworth used the upper studio as a flexible space. But regarding the small quantity of copper sulfate which was found, rereading Sophie's book, I was reminded that the upper studio was where the sheet metal works were made, and these must have been coloured on site. So possibly this was used for that. So I haven't tested copper sulfate on sheet copper. I don't know what the effect is. Now, things you can get a bit carried away with all this stuff. And I like to think, there's this lovely tin of bronze shavings. And I love to think of Hepworth making her own copper acetate up using white vinegar, because that's something that's quite easily done. And it fits with my idea of Hepworth. It's just my idea of Hepworth. Or homemade ferric nitrate, which you can make using rusty nails. So for me, that fits with my idea of how the studio worked, where they saved everything and put these little scraps in bottles, and everything's in pine essence bath bottles, and it just fits with how I feel it works. But it has to just be speculation, I'm afraid. Anyway, just to finish, it's been great to have this opportunity to look more carefully at the evidence for Hepworth colouring bronzes on site. And when I got the invitation to attend this event, I hoped there might be a focus on this area of colour and bronzes, and I quickly wrote some possible research questions, so I'm just finished with those. I'm not going to read them. But I was really happy to find that Laura's talk to start with, and Lindsay's talk, which is following mine, address and answer a lot of the same questions. So that's that. Lindsay's very efficient. She sent them to me as a Word doc. So, yes, here I am again, and you have to imagine someone smarter and more organised looking. Anyway, it's very, it was great when Lindsay sent through this, because I just thought, if some of you are kind of boggling your minds about chemicals and the way they work and everything, this does this will be helpful. So Lindsay wanted to talk to you today about Barbara Hepworth's radical use of artificial patina on bronze sculptures, and to discuss some of the dilemmas that arise when treating her outdoor sculptures. I have to say, this is based on Lindsay's practical experience. So to understand artificial patination, it's useful to look at the natural coloration of bronze first. Bronze is an alloy of copper and produces a range of colored compounds when it reacts with the environment. Brown and green are the most common colors to see. Brown forms first, like the penny on the left. Then bronze turns green after longer exposure to water and oxygen. These images of Rodin's Kiss are to show the progression of a sculpture outdoors. It may start with the traditional brown finish, but after many decades outdoors without maintenance, the sculpture will look more like the one in the center. The image on the right is to show the contrast with a sculpture that has been well maintained. It has still changed, but it is aging more gracefully. The green in the middle could be more accurately called corrosion rather than patina. The surface of the metal is dissolving away, and the black and green streaks are visually disfiguring to the form. Artificial patination can mimic the effect of exposure outdoors, but much more quickly. Instead of leaving a sculpture out in atmosphere for months or years, you can achieve the same effect in hours. It starts with cleaning the bronze. You can see the stages of this on the left. Or does she mean the right? Can't see from here. The top left shows investment from the mold still clinging to the surface. Sorry, I have a problem with left and right. No, she has got it right, hasn't she? It's me. So yes, that's the top left. So the investment from the mold is the sort of white stuff that you can see clinging to that. This image shows the bronze after sandblasting to remove this, and at the bottom, fine abrasive surface finishing to create a more reflective finish. So that's the three slides on top of each other on the left. Reactive chemical solutions are then applied to the surface, which can be done either hot, like the image is shown, or cold. So that's where you see the blowtorch there, which is heating the bronze. A huge range of colours are possible using different chemical mixtures. Further effects can be created by layering different colours and concentrations. Patinas may not just be chemical. Foundries may also add coloured waxes, inks, or pigments. Whereas most artists have used chemical patina on bronze as an all-over treatment in the past, Hepworth is less bound by tradition and uses the technique in a far more inventive way, so that she can use colour as freely on her bronzes as she does with her other sculpture. Unlike many artists of the time, she communicated closely with the foundries she worked with, encouraging them to produce new and specific colours for her so that she could achieve the effect she wanted. She then sometimes worked on these patinas herself when the foundry returned them to her. So this is, there is documentary evidence for this, which I should have mentioned in my talk, actually. Most of the sculptures shown here are intended for display indoors, and so they remain in good condition, provided they are well looked after. So yeah, there's a pretty good range of different finishes on those. But what about the sculptures meant for outdoor display? Hepworth used some extremely unusual colours and effects on her outdoor bronzes, and it is difficult to think of another artist at this time who was colouring bronze in such an innovative way. In these early images of three obliques walk-in, you can see some extraordinary stippled effects with green and white patinas that no one else was using at that time. These have been sharply contrasted with the reddish-brown edges and highly polished inner surfaces of the rings. But to look at these hang on, I think she means me to go to the next slide. Yes, so same sculpture after years of weathering. But to look at these weathered versions around 45 years later, you would never know that those colours were there. The archival images shown in the previous slide, so I'll just go back, just to show that contrast, are therefore enormously important to help us gain an understanding of artists' intent. Similarly, these early images of Foursquare walkthrough give us tantalizing information about Hepworth's original radical colour scheme. Although the colour values of the slides vary significantly, and again, that going back to Laura's point about the photographs, and you have to kind of be aware of the different film and different effects. It is possible to see that this sculpture was originally patinated with contrasting colours on each face. Green and black at the base, with brown, green, and maybe white or pale green at the top. The inner surfaces of the rings have also been polished. In the second slide from the left, you can see one of the patinators from the foundry putting the finishing touches to the sculpture in Hepworth's garden in St Ives. Can you? Where's that? Can you spot it? I can't. Oh, right. Yes, it's got. Oh, yes, yes. It's very difficult to see. Yeah, and it does look kind of white at the top there. But after years of display, these casts have become more uniform so that the contrasts are barely visible and many of the original colours are gone. After exposure to weathering, all the original coloured compounds have changed or worn away. So different casts, same thing happening. For conservators, it is important to understand what we are dealing with, and many of us are used to thinking that the answers to this lie in chemical analysis. However, the results of this can often be disappointing, as they can be obscure and difficult to interpret. In truth, learning about practical processes can be far more illuminating. Sometimes the best way to really understand something is to do it yourself, which I would totally endorse, as my recent patinating experience proved. Lindsay started out her research into artificial patinas by interviewing a number of foundries as part of her MPhil research in the late 1990s. Much of this process, the foundry process, is shrouded in secrecy, but some people would... Is that my own phone ringing? Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll just leave it. Anyway, apologies to Lindsay for that. So Lindsay started out her research into artificial patinas by interviewing a number of foundries as part of her MPhil research in the late 1990s. And much of the foundry process, as we've been discussing, is shrouded in secrecy. But some people were generous with their time and knowledge so that she could see the process of artificial patination taking place and learn more about the chemical recipes used. Armed with this information, she then carried out a lot of experiments so that she could find out how the process works in practice. Here are some of the tests that she has carried out over the years. At the bottom are some of the most recent tests she did in collaboration with Tessa to replicate the appearance of Hepworth's white patinas based on archival information. Aside from practical treatments and archival research, we may also learn a lot through the treatment itself. Here's a treatment Lindsay carried out with Laura Davis and Tessa Jackson, who have both spoken, on the cast of Foursquare Walkthrough in Tate's St Ives in collaboration with Tate's Sculpture Conservation Section. The sculpture had been well maintained over the years, but the surface appeared more uniformly green, and the rings were now tarnished to a dark brown, as in earlier slides. Before this treatment, the team consulted the early images of the work and talked about how it might be possible to reinstate some colour contrast using reversible tinted waxes. With a sculpture in such good condition, chemical repatination would never be considered, as it is too permanent. However, the cleaning revealed that much of the original colour scheme was still there, and that it had just been obscured by layers of wax. Here you can see the removal of old wax with steam, and then the process of warming new clear waxes into the bronze surface to saturate the colours, so that, in the end, no tinted waxes were necessary. As a final stage, the inner rings were repolished and lacquered in close consultation with the artist's estate. An unexpected benefit of the treatment was that it was suddenly easier to see the artist's intentional textiles, which is textures applied with various tools, which is what Laura showed us earlier. The hammer mark is one. This is to show you walkthrough in the St Ives garden before and after treatment. The pale colours visible in the original images at the top of the sculpture had weathered away, so it does not look the same as the original, but perhaps it has been brought closer to the artist's intent. We know that Hepworth periodically had the rings on her sculptures repolished while she was alive, and that she also asked for some of her white patinas to be reinstated. She obviously understood that her sculptures would weather with time, but it is difficult to know how far she would have wanted us to go in those cases when all colours and contrasts are lost. In the end, I think that we have all found that with Hepworth, the more you look, the more you see. Observation without assumption is crucial. In the last few years, we have combined close observation of surfaces revealed by cleaning with archival sources and have learned a great deal more about the subtlety of Hepworth's use of colour on her bronzes. The images above show you some examples. It seems that we cannot assume that brown was just brown. Sometimes brown was combined with green, as in the images on the left, and sometimes with the underlying gold colour from the bronze itself, as in the effect seen on the right. So I hope all these can be clearly seen. Lindsay hopes we can spread this information more widely amongst those who have these sculptures in their care to help inform for future treatment of all of Hepworth's work.
That was really interesting, and thank you again, Melanie, for reading out Lindsay's paper. I think it was great to have that addition as well, even though she can't be here.
Yes, replicate her expertise.
I might just go straight to the audience because we are running a little bit over time. Are there any burning immediate questions for either? No? If not, I might say... oh, sorry, Sarah. Yes. Yeah, please.
So I just need to understand the process. She worked with the foundry, and she would talk about how she would want patina applied, but then she would work again in the studio with...
Well, this is what we don't really know, but what we do know is that she worked very closely with the foundry, and there is this correspondence, and she had this relationship with Eric Gibbard, was it, at the foundry? And the foundry had at least 2 patinas, which they labelled Hepworth 1 and 2 as sort of standard to use for a brown or a blue-green. But obviously they had more because there was this additional one which they came and applied in the garden, being a cold patina, so that's kind of easier to do. Sorry. Did no one hear any of that? Yeah, so we know that they sort of had they had a fairly long distance communication, but she was much more closely involved than was standard.
Because I'm seeing Seaform, Porthmeer at the Rodin recently, and looking at the quality of brushmark almost on the surface of that, and it being so integral to the movement and form of the work. It's just trying to understand how much she would have had say over, the application of because it just seems so much like the artist's hand in that sense, and it's
right.
So integral to the movement.
Do you mean the brush marks in sort of colour?
Yeah, in the colour. Yeah.
All right, 'cause I can't comment because
No.
I don't know that work and I haven't worked on it. Though the ones in the garden have all weathered down, and there are a number where we still don't know. There's as Lindsay and Laura I think have shown really well. We're really trying to use the documentary sources available in order to try and get a sense of what the colours were. There are some which I don't know how many images are available, whether with sculptures like that which don't have such a marked inside and outside, they may not have been as contrasted. There may have been maybe she wanted them to look brown with just a hint of green, which is more or less what they look now. But certainly there are many sculptures in the garden that have gone down to that sort of general greenish-ness because of the policy of just maintaining and trying not to change and doing what's necessary, which has been... but I just wanted to say what I almost said at the end there, which is, we really want to carry on building on this understanding about how Hepworth used colour on bronze and what she wanted, and it may not be possible to tell, and there are these conflicting quotes from her about weathering, but it is something that concerns the wider museum world. I was asked a few years ago by SF MoMA. They said, can we take the sculptures in the garden in St Ives as that's how they should look. So if we've got those, we should take them as our model. And I was like, no, you really can't, because most of the time we don't know. You've got to try and look back at the if there are original images and so on. But we just need to keep going with this, I think.
Again, it's conjecture really, but the Getty Institute did a fairly comprehensive study of Figure for Landscape. Is that right, Derek? Is it the one? And using all their resources, funding and technology, they did identify, on top of the chemical patina, several layers of wax and pigment, which maybe Hepworth might have added herself or altered the patina after it had come back. There definitely correspondence to and fro to alter things. So I can't really say, but it's nice to think of the chemical patina achieved by chemicals, but then also wax and pigments on top can really affect and change the look of the sculpture.
Passing it along. Also, the thing is, when you're putting a patination chemical onto a bronze, you have to get rid of all the wax, so they have to be completely unwaxed to make it work. So, as she had got patination chemicals in her studio, she must have been patinating some of them. But if she had something come back from the foundry, it'd be extremely unlikely, unless she asked for it not to be waxed, that she would alter it when it came back, I would imagine. Derek?
Well, can I suggest that bronzes get marked, rubbed, especially when they're being moved around, and it would be sensible to have, as it were, a first aid kit of chemicals for correcting things.
Yeah, I think that's probably what that stuff is. I think there's one bit of, sorry, Sarah, to go back to what you did ask, I think there is one letter or something in the earlier days when she wasn't using Morris Singer. She says, I've had to sort this out. It looked awful, and it looks like they've sorted it out then on site. But in the later times, I think probably more likely, as Derek's saying, it's a maintenance thing.
And in terms of future projects, what we've always lacked is any proper description of patinas. Brown with a bit of green is really not quite adequate. For geology, say, you can describe a rock very precisely so that somebody on the other side of the world knows exactly what you're talking about. But with a patina, at the moment, you can't. And we just don't have the language yet, and I don't know how we get around it, but it would be great to have some movement in that direction. I hope that wasn't on. No readers were around.
I think Hannah.
But just very quickly to add to some of these points, this is obviously the launch of the Hepworth Research Network, but what I hope to do, and we've been inviting curators and people who look after other collections who hold Hepworths within their collection, and the aim is that as this grows and continues, we will have sort of representatives attending from collections such as National Galleries of Scotland, where there are these Hepworth holdings, and perhaps these conversations can be a bit more joined up about how they are treated, so there's a sort of consistent approach to dealing with these questions that we're talking about between artist intention and conservation. Hannah?
Well, my question was actually quite related to your point, Ellen, and as much as I was wondering if there's any correlation, just building on the previous question about the application of patinas and when we can tell, or when a trace of Hepworth's hand versus a kind of foundry patination has been done, and if there's any correlation between those early wartime kind of plaster works where presumably that's all Hepworth and she's applying the paint in that way, and if there's any kind of linking that can be done across material so that it's not just considering kind of the application of patina, but the application of colour more generally, maybe.
Mm.
Yes, probably. Yes, I mean, I do feel, I'm sorry because my knowledge is sort of limited within it. But yes, I think looking at the colour, I mean, even like Chris was talking about the colours of stones and things, and the sort of the way she changed the interest in surface is an area which I think, the more people talk about that, look into that, would be extremely helpful for this issue of how the bronzes should look.
Just a slight note on that. We have Hepworth's wave carved, strung with twine, painted, sculpture, and we have a letter from her to our founding keeper Douglas Hall talking about the paint, and she was more bothered that it should be painted than the specific colour. So almost that combination of wood and twine and paint was the key thing, and then the specific shade of paint came after that.
I think that's very interesting. What struck me actually across the talks was this idea that actually Laura mentioned as well, that in everything that she was making across materials, she was finding her own way of making. And you mentioned this idea that in terms of patina, she was finding her a unique way of using, of colouring bronzes. I think was that in Lindsay's. But it seemed to chime with something that she wrote in the letter to Sadie Spate about finding a way of connecting colour and form that, what did she say? It was something that no one else has done, apart from maybe Leslie in architecture. I wonder what she meant by that. Do you have a thought?
Yes, I'm not that aware of colour in his architecture because he was very much a white interiors man. We've got elderly friends who had a sort of art gallery with fine art ceramics in Cambridge, and Sadie Spate used to come in and taught them that there were 17 shades of beige. So I think that she and Leslie had a very acutely calibrated colour sense, but as far as I can gather, and from the Leslie Martin houses, modernist houses that I've been in, they've all had a pure white interior, so I'm not sure where that came from.
What do you think she might have meant by her own sort of innovations in terms of colour and form?
Well, I suppose at that point it seemed to be the painted plaster that she was talking about, and then the addition of strings, although she didn't mention that particular letter about the colour of the strings. And you presume that they were done with plaster because that was the material that was available during the war. I mean, I'm quite interested in the fact that having used white plaster, when she was able to get more material, she didn't then use a sort of white stone or a white marble. She seems to go into wood and then into casting, if that's fair. So I don't know how much importance the whiteness of the plaster had for her, if at all.
Any other questions before we move on to the final panel? No? Good. All right. Well, please, thank you very much, both of you.